Hello, this is Professor Allen. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the risk register and all the columns contained within. So on your screen, you should see the risk register. In this video, it's referred to as the risk plan. However, this terminology is not always consistent, and the risk plan is, in fact, the risk register. Let's start with the very first column. It's just a sequential number. It's just a way to reference and sort risks from low to high, high to low. The second column is the risk event description. This is where you describe the risk itself. So there's an example here, and the example reads, insufficient number of skilled internal technical resources available to support the development of the new system. So that's fairly specific. And this is the way you want to write your risks, because if they're too general, you can't really develop the appropriate strategy to deal with them. If you get a little more specific, then it's easier to both score the risks in terms of likelihood and impact, but also determine how to best address that risk. Now, what you might want to do for a risk event description is also describe the impact that it's having to the project. So in this example, insufficient number of skilled internal technical resources available to support development of the new system. You may want to add to this by saying insufficient number of skilled internal technical resources available to support development of the new system may cause a schedule delay. So that would be the impact, or what I call the so what factor. So at the very end of the risk event description, if you can, identify the impact to the project. Then it's clear. The next column is the category. It's really a column you can use for anything, which allows you to sort or group things later. It could be the sub-project, project phase, location, anything that you think you want to use to categorize a risk. Some people use things like procurement risks. They'll put the word procurement there. And for schedule risks, they'll put schedule there. Or for permitting risks, they'll use a category called permitting. It's totally available for your use. The next column is called likelihood, and this is the column where we identify how likely is it that this risk will occur during the execution of the project. And the way this tool is designed that I have right now, it's a simple high, medium, and low. So if I go ahead and click on it, there are three choices in the drop-down, H, M, or L. Now, what does a high, medium, and low mean? It's a relative term. It's fairly subjective, but under the Impacts Defined tab, you'll see some definition here. Low means it's unlikely, a medium means it's likely, and a high means it's almost certain to occur. So previous to this, I used to use probability, but what I soon realized was that I didn't have data to support probability and analysis around the risks, so I was guessing anyway. So rather than try to make it look more scientific than it is, I went to a more subjective high, medium, and low for the likelihood as well as the impacts. So the next section are the impacts, and here we have schedule, cost, quality, safety, and scope. An impact basically means when the risk occurs, what it's going to impact. So if it happens, what am I worried about? What is it going to hit? So in the case of this example, we have insufficient number of skilled resources available. So basically, if we don't have enough resources to do the work, it's going to impact our schedule, and that's probably going to impact it high. So that's where you see an H in the schedule risk. So if I click on the drop down here, again, you'll see high, medium, and low. And if I go back to the impacts, you're going to see a definition. And you can change this. So these are yours to change. So schedule, the way I have it right now, says there's no impact to critical path or field work. That would be what a low means. A medium means there's a potential to impact the critical path or the field work. And a high means it's certain to affect the critical path or field work, meaning if the risk happens, it will delay work in the field or the critical path of the project. Okay, the other impacts are very similar. So you have impact on cost. So will this risk, if it occurs, impact the overall cost of the project or budget? Will it affect the quality? Will it affect the safety? Will people get hurt? Will it affect the scope? In the case of scope, what this means is, will it add more work? If this risk happens, will I have more work to do or potentially have to rework a bunch of things, which will equate to more work? So again, going back to the impacts defined, we have cost here. Low means less than $100,000. A medium is 100 to 500,000, and a high is greater than 500,000. Well, if those ranges are way too high for your project, just simply go in and change it. So I can edit this and I can put 10,000 here for a low. I can put, let's say, $25,000 for the high end for the medium. So basically, it's changing everything for me. And here, you can see if it's greater than 25,000, then that would be a high risk. So I've just changed the definitions here. And the whole point of having this impacts defined matrix here, these definitions, is so that when you go ahead and score risks, you have a reference so you can do them in a consistent manner. So if you talk to a finance person, anything over $1 is a high cost risk. But if you talk to somebody else on a project, well, they might say, well, if it's not more than $10,000 or $50,000, it's probably a low risk because this is a $100 million project. So it's all relative, but if you agree on with your team the definitions are, and you all apply it consistently, you're going to have a better outcome. Then you see qualities defined here. A medium quality impact means a moderate impact to product deliverables, and a high means a major impact to product deliverables. What this basically means is that projects produce deliverables or products, and if the risk occurs, if the particular risk occurs, will it affect the quality of whatever I'm producing? If I'm building a structure, a building, is it going to impact the quality of that building? If I'm producing a document or a report, is it going to impact the quality of that document or report? If I'm developing software, is it going to impact the quality of the software, where that software might have a lot of bugs and problems? Safety, as we talked about earlier, a low here means no impact to worker safety, meaning if the risk occurs, it doesn't really affect safety. No one's going to get hurt. If it's a office type project where you're doing some sort of implementation of let's say an SAP or a Oracle system, it's unlikely that you have to worry about any safety issues on your project because you're in an office environment, and the worst thing you're going to have happen is a paper cut or maybe somebody slips in a lunchroom. But it's not something you'd probably factor into your project. But if it was a construction project of a high-rise building and you're putting up steel, 40 stories high, well, if there may be certain risks, could be related to icy conditions or inclement weather or improper tie-offs, where the risk of somebody getting injured or in fact dying could be very high if that risk came to fruition. So you'd have a range here from no impact at all to a major impact. And then scope, this is a percentage, but you could put words here if you don't like the percentages, but it basically means is if this risk occurs, will there be more work to do? And the low says, well, if there is, it's less than 1%. It's very minor. A high says it's greater than 5%. So there's a bunch more work that will have to happen if this risk occurs. I'm going to go back to our risk register, and what you'll notice here is it scores out the risks using a weighted average scoring mechanism. And basically what it does is depending on whether you pick a high, medium, or low, it assigns a value behind the scenes. And the lowest possible score you can get for a risk is 5, and the highest possible score you can get for a risk is 125. So the number isn't that important, but it gives you a relative importance of the risk. Because if I didn't have a score there and I was just looking at a bunch of letters like HHHMLL, and I was trying to compare that to an HHMMHL versus a MHHHHLL, I wouldn't know what I was looking at. But if I can put a number to it, it gives me a better understanding of how important that risk is, because the higher the number, the more attention I'm going to give it. So if I have a risk that scores a 75 and I have another one that scores a 7, guess what? I'm going to be putting all my time into the 75 and spending very little or no time on the 7. The next column is the risk event drivers, and these are things that you can look for that sometimes are called leading indicators that a risk might be ready to occur or getting closer to occurring. So in this case, some of the risk event drivers for the insufficient number of skilled internal technical resources are that we start to see slippages in the schedule, we see excessive overtime being used, we see a high number of quality errors. All of these might be drivers telling you that you have an insufficient number of skilled internal technical resources available. So each risk you can think through and figure out what are the drivers that I could watch for, kind of like a gas gauge in your car, that would tell me that the risk was going to potentially occur. So if you are worried about running out of gas in your car as a risk, as an example, well, when the vehicle gets to a certain level in the gas tank, there's going to be a light that pops up, right? So that would be an example of a risk event driver. I'll call it the yellow light. And then there might be a beep, and then eventually there might be a countdown. So the car might start at 50 miles, and then it might go to 49, then the 48. All these are drivers that you can monitor that says, okay, I think I better get some gas because if I don't, something bad's going to happen. So you have your yellow light come on, you have some dinging on your dashboard, you have the countdown, and at some point the car, perhaps at around 20 miles or something of that nature, it stops counting. So it might go from 25 miles left to 24 to 23 to 22 to 20, and then that doesn't count anymore. It just stops. And the reason it stops is because it's telling you, hey, I've already showed you my yellow light. I've dinged and I gave you a countdown and you're still not getting gas. I'm not responsible for you running out of gas anymore. I'm not even going to bother counting. It's all on you now. So basically, I don't think the car wants to take the responsibility of being that precise when it gets below 20 miles to keep counting how many miles are left in the vehicle. So at that point, you're kind of on your own. You have to now look at the gas gauge. And that gas gauge, if it's a little bit above E, you're probably still okay. But now let's say the gas gauge is on E, or perhaps it's a little below E. That's another event driver that you can monitor that says, guess what? You're really getting close to running out of gas, so you probably should have done it already. I've done everything in my power to remind you. And finally, the last event driver that you might experience before you actually run out of gas is the car might start sputtering, when it's choking and running out of gas. And at that point, you might have about, I don't know, 100 yards or 50 yards to get to a gas station. So you better hope that there's a gas station nearby that you can roll right into. But those are all the drivers that you're going to see before the risk occurs. And the risk is that you ran out of gas. The next column is the risk or response mitigation strategy. So basically, this is describing what you're going to do to deal with this risk. Remember, we're dealing with the risk event which has not yet happened. So what are you going to do to mitigate this risk, which is basically trying to reduce the likelihood that it will occur or reduce some of the impacts or both? What are you going to do to try to transfer this risk perhaps to a third party, like a service provider or an insurance company? Or what are you going to do to basically accept the risk. So if you're going to say, well, I'm just really going to accept this risk and I'm not going to take any action, you can write that in here that no planned actions risk will be accepted. That's another strategy. Or the last strategy is avoid. So what can you do to avoid the risk? Now, it'd be great if you could just avoid every risk that was out there. The problem with this strategy is it's difficult because the only way to avoid a risk typically is to cut some scope out of your project. In a sense, not do something. For example, in the gas example, where you're worried about running out of gas, well, the only way really to avoid that is to don't drive a car. You know, you'd have to walk or take a bike or do something else, or perhaps live in an apartment right next to work or wherever you're worried about. But you can't easily prevent yourself from running out of gas. You could fill up your tank the night before. However, what if somebody siphoned it out overnight? Or what if you had a leak in your tank, you didn't realize it, and it all leaked out? So there's lots of different things that you think you're eliminating the risk, but in fact you're not. You're just mitigating it. So the only way to truly eliminate a risk or avoid it is often just to remove it from scope, not do something. Okay, the next column is called contingency plan, and this is basically my plan B. So if this risk does happen, now what am I going to do? So you're not trying to mitigate or avoid or transfer the risk anymore. You're dealing with an issue now. Basically, it's happened. You're sitting on a freeway without any gas. Now what? You know, do you have AAA? Do you have, roadside service? Do you have a friend you can call? Do you have a bicycle in your trunk? How are you going to get to wherever you're going to go? Um, so in this case, for the example I provided, insufficient number of skilled internal technical resources, the contingency plan, if that happened, is to outsource portions of the development to an outside vendor or adjust the project schedule and budget to allow for the delay. There are a whole lot of things that you can do. The next column is called owner. This is the person who's responsible to monitor this risk, monitor the drivers, update these columns and fields, determine what the mitigation strategy and the contingency plan is, and continually monitor the risk scoring for likelihood and impacts. Because as time goes on, the likelihood of the risk may increase or decrease, and the impacts may increase or decrease. And typically, I would revisit a risk at least once a month, depending on the length of the project. The next column is the risk time frame. When could this risk happen? So some risks, they could happen anytime during the whole project. Some of them, after a certain point in the project, can no longer occur. So if there's any particular critical dates of exposure, you can put those here. And then the next column is called organizational or cross project impacts. And this is a way to identify risks that have an impact if they occur on either A, the organization or your company, maybe not your project, but it has an impact to your company, or it has an impact on some other project, but not necessarily, well, it'll be this project and probably another project. So if there's an impact to another project or the company at large, you'd want to put a yes there and then notify the proper person in the organization or the project manager from the other project that, hey, if my risk happens, it's going to impact you as well. One example might be if you're doing a project that has, let's say, is in the eye of the public, meaning it's somewhere where the public can view it, and you have some kind of a disaster on that project, something bad that happens, that could be an impact to the reputation of your company. And that risk could have an organizational impact overall. And then the last column I'm going to talk about here is the comments. So this is where you can just put in general comments that you want to keep notes on. I often, if I use this column, I will put the name of the person who made the comment, the date, and what the comment was. So somebody might talk about the event drivers. They might talk about something that happened that may lead to this risk occurring, or they might talk about when they last updated it. It's a column available for really for any use that you want. Okay, well that wraps up this video description of the risk register, talking about the different columns that are available in the risk register. And this is a really good tool. It's something I would recommend for virtually any project. It's not hard to operate. It may look a little complicated, but once you get used to it, it's pretty easy to use and to navigate and to to score your projects so that you know where you stand with your risks. One thing I would recommend is try not to let your risks get too busy where you have a long list of risks that are out there for a project. And the reason for that is if you have too many, then basically you're not going to work on any of them. So I've been on projects where we sat in a conference room for 8 hours and dreamed up every possible risk for a project, came up with over 200 risks, and nobody has time to manage 200 risks. So and what ended up happening is that the risk list just got stale. We didn't really revisit it. So keep it, it's okay to brainstorm and get everything on a list, but then the low scoring risks, I wouldn't put much attention into. I probably just accept many of those and close them out. But the high scoring risks, especially the reds, which are scoring 75 or higher, those are going to need the most attention, and then the yellows would be in a range below that. Those are the ones I'd focus on the most. So I hope you enjoyed this video. There's much more to talk about with risk management and risk registers, but I think this is a really good start for this particular topic, and I think we covered a lot of ground. So thank you for listening. This is Professor Allen signing off.